In the 9,000th year of the Ashen calendar, when the lamps of the upper spires burned with whale oil drawn from extinct seas, and the last snows had retreated from the bronze battlements of the sanctified pole, the throne world prepared itself for worship. Across the continents, bells of iron and fossil ivory were raised into motion by chained choirs. Processions climbed the mountain roads in their millions. Incense furnaces were kindled in plazas vast as inland gulfs. In the Hall of Ember Testaments, where the dead emperors watched from alcoves of obsidian and gold, scribes sharpened their quills to record another night of uninterrupted dominion. Nothing in the rites admitted the possibility of surprise. The oldest empire of men had outlived astonishment and made a cathedral of certainty. Yet above that certainty, the void changed color. At first it was taken for an omen favorable to power. A green star appeared over the eastern hemisphere, burning low and unnatural, its tail braided with streams of jade fire. Astrologers in the high observatories prostrated themselves before their brass lenses, naming it a victory sign, a beacon, a torch borne by the dead to salute the living sovereign. Monastic mathematicians recalculated its course with trembling hands and found, to their mounting confusion, that the star did not obey the old harmonies. It swerved where no body could swerve. It slowed without reason. It descended not as a wanderer of the heavens, but as something that had chosen a destination long before men built towers to study the sky. The first to speak against joy were the watch serfs stationed upon the outer moon forts. Their reports reached the throne world in fragments of static and prayer. They said the comet had texture. They said it carried no ice, no stone, no metallic shell. They said there was a shape inside the burning, vast and coiled, like a mountain remembering how to breathe. Then the transmissions ceased, one bastion after another, snuffed out with such speed that the silence itself seemed organized. On the world below, the pilgrim roads filled still more thickly. No warning was issued. The great institutions of rule had become too immense to imagine immediate danger. Councils disputed jurisdiction. Marshals demanded certainty from scholars, and scholars requested more hours from the heavens. In the meantime, the green light grew. It washed over cathedral fronts and citadel walls. It stained the snow peaks with the hue of drowned copper. It entered stained glass and transformed the saints into things gaunt and predatory. In the lower hive cities, where the air was already green with chem smoke, the laboring multitudes looked up through slits of alleyway sky and crossed themselves with soot-black fingers. Mothers barred windows. Shrine-keepers overturned votive bowls and read the patterns of spilled ash. Hounds began to howl in the undervaults. In the necropolis fields west of the imperial meridian, burial lamps went out one by one, though no wind moved. The sovereign on the throne did not speak. He had not spoken in many centuries. Still, within the innermost sanctum, where auric engines moaned and capillaries of light fed the ancient seat, there passed a tremor through the assembled guardians. Those bred from oath and surgery felt it in the iron nails of their bones. Those born to the cloth felt it in the shrines implanted behind their eyes. The oldest among them, whose memories stretched back through dynasties of obedience, turned toward the sealed dome overhead as if hearing footsteps in deep water. Then the comet entered the atmosphere. The sky did not blaze. It sickened. Cloud banks rolled aside as though pushed by invisible walls. The green fire wrapped itself tighter around the descending shape until the world saw, for the first time, the profile hidden in the radiance. A colossal head thrust forward on a neck plated in ancient armor of living scale, shoulders like black promontories, a spine crowned by jagged dorsal crests that gathered light and returned it sharpened. Its body was neither holy beast nor holy catastrophe. It resembled an animal only in the same manner that a plague resembles a season. Size had become theology in it. It was too vast to enter the categories men used for monsters. The creature did not descend into history. History broke around its arrival. It struck the outer sea east of the capital and did not vanish beneath the waters. The impact lifted an ocean. Harbor chains snapped. Fortress lighthouses were uprooted from their stone roots and swallowed whole. The first wall of water traveled inland at the speed of divine anger, carrying with it warships, pilgrim barges, and pieces of shattered islands. Along the coast, whole penitential cities were erased before their inhabitants understood they were under sentence. From the terraces of the imperial palace, commanders watched the inundation reach the horizon roads. They saw tides hammering through basilicas, drowning markets, wrenching statues from plinths 100 meters tall. But even then the water was not the worst of it, for the thing that had risen from the sea now walked. With each step, districts trembled. Ancient causeways collapsed into trenches. The vaulted bones of underground transit ways cracked open. On its back the dorsal spines awakened one after another, a procession of emerald suns igniting along the creature's spine from tail to skull. The light they gave was not light as men knew it. It possessed weight. It pressed on temple domes and made the golden saint figures atop them glow from within, as though their hollowness had suddenly been revealed. The first defense batteries fired from the ring forts beyond the eastern marches. Their shells crossed the night in chains of red and white. Macro lances speared downward from orbit. Choir-guided missiles, sanctified with oils and martyr blood, screamed their names into the dark. Impacts flowered across the Titan's hide. For an instant, the world believed in engineering again. Fire engulfed the beast from shoulder to jaw. Towers shook with the force of the bombardment. Officers gave thanks. Priests cried that the heavens had vindicated mankind. Then the fire thinned. Through the burning veils, the creature continued forward, its hide scorched but unbroken, its eyes like furnaces banked behind volcanic glass. No wrath was visible in it, no frenzy, no ecstasy of destruction. It advanced with the composure of an old law resuming effect after ages of neglect. Beneath the palace mountain, in archives sealed long before the first coronation, dust fell from forgotten vaults. Seals cracked on doors whose inscriptions no living tongue could wholly read. Deep in the foundations of empire, mechanisms stirred that had slept since the world was young and less ashamed. The planet itself seemed to recognize the tread of the intruder. When at last the beast opened its jaws, every witness expected a roar. What came instead was a silence so profound that bells ceased mid-swing, lungs failed in prayer, and for the span of a single impossible heartbeat, the whole throne world seemed to listen to something beneath sound. Then a green radiance gathered in the creature's throat, and the night learned it had not yet reached its deepest terror. When the radiance left the beast's throat, it did not travel as flame travels, nor as lightning, nor as any honest force named by the sciences of men. It emerged as a pillar of concentrated verdict, green-white at its heart and mantled in veils of spectral fire, a river of annihilation descending in a single line from heaven toward the earth that had dared enthrone itself. The beam crossed the drowned eastern marches and found the first of the throne sector bastions, that adamantine fortress city whose foundations had survived 4 ages of rebellion and 2 of civil sunfire. For one immeasurable instant, the keep remained visible within the glare, every wall, turret, shrine spire, and garrison dome preserved in perfect outline, as if the weapon wished the world to memorize what it was about to lose. Then the bastion ceased to be a structure and became weather. Stone became ash before it could break, armor became vapor before it could melt. Men, banners, chapel bells, relic vaults, war engines and archives black with old decrees passed together into a brightness so complete that their destruction resembled revelation. The beam raked onward, and the plain beneath it opened like rotten cloth. Trenches became glowing seams, burial fields burst upward in plumes of steaming bone. Rivers fled their courses and rose as poisoned mist. The sacred roads by which the pilgrim hosts had climbed toward the capital became lines of glass. Across the outer districts of the capital continent, the night turned green as submerged bronze. Windows exploded inward. Shrine lamps erupted in showers of molten oil. High above the avenues, the tolling towers of the palace quarter split down their length and collapsed in majestic silence before the sound reached the streets below. Only after the beam had passed did the thunder come, and when it came it was not one noise but a legion of them, the groaning of ancient metal, the concussions of ruptured void coils, the shriek of air dragged suddenly into infernos vast as provinces. The world shook as if some buried giant beneath the crust had rolled in its sleep. Within the command sanctuaries of the throne sector, orders were issued with a precision already overtaken by ruin. Martial prelates in Baroque armor dictated fallback coordinates to regiments that no longer existed. Orbital admirals called for descending kill satellites and received only static and fragments of prayer. The choir of rectitude, those blind cantors trained from infancy to guide munitions by sacramental mathematics, continued their hymns even as the ceilings above them melted in ropes of iron. Duty did not perish swiftly in that empire. It persisted beyond sense, beyond hope, beyond the evidence of the eyes. The second discharge came before the first smoke had settled. This time the creature swept its head westward, and the beam carved across the lower ring of palace defenses, shearing through mountain batteries, monastery forts, and monumental walls engraved with the victories of dead millennia. Entire terraces detached from the palace massif and tumbled into the city beneath, taking gardens, arsenals, and statuary legions with them. The great avenue of supplication, where uncounted generations had crawled on bloodied knees toward the sovereign's distant light, became a canyon of fused marble, bordered by fires that burned green at their core and black at their edges. Then the defense grids answered in their fullness. All along the throne sector, hidden cupolas irised open. From beneath basilicas and sepulchres, from under triumphal arches and manufactories disguised as memorials, there rose the old weapons of the inner dominion. Lance arrays awakened with shrieks like torn brass. Gravimetric catapults hurled caskets of singularity flame. Vaulted missile organs, each shell sanctified by mortuary rites older than dynasties, emptied themselves into the sky in staggered volleys that turned the heavens to a mesh of incandescent script. From orbit, the surviving platforms of the crown ring released spears of white solar judgment that descended in perfect columns around the advancing beast, hemming it in with annihilation. For a moment, the Titan disappeared within a continent of light. The gathered watchers upon the innermost palace walls, those few who still possessed walls from which to watch, believed, because belief was the last weapon that had not yet jammed in their hands. They saw the bombardment consume districts and flatten hills. They saw the very clouds burn away. They saw the sea itself retreat from the heat and expose black reefs older than mankind's memory. No flesh could endure such punishment. No god of matter could remain standing beneath that labor of destruction. Yet when the radiance ebbed, a shape still moved inside it. The creature emerged through the inferno wreathed in molten scales and storms of ash. Wounds glowed along its shoulders like fresh volcanoes. One of the dorsal spines had been shattered, and from its ruin poured streams of green fire into the streets below. But the beast did not falter. If pain lived in it, pain had not taught it caution. Its vast feet entered the eastern precincts of the capital, crushing ministries, reliquaries, and census towers beneath claws longer than cathedral naves. Every step remade the map. Whole neighborhoods vanished under its weight, not with the violence of an impact now, but with the terrible finality of something passing over grain. Beneath the palace mountain, deeper than the crypts of kings and the engine chambers of saints, another drama unfolded in chambers to which no sun had ever sent a ray. Ancient seals groaned open under stresses transmitted through bedrock and forgotten machinery. Coffins of basalt split in dust-clogged corridors. Lamps that had not burned in 2,000 years guttered briefly alive. There were records there from the First Age, from before the throne world had become holy to itself, and in those records was the memory of a warning never entered into the canon. That memory now stirred like a corpse, recognizing the hand that had slain it. In the upper sanctum before the immobile sovereign enthroned amidst pain engines and votive lightning, the guardians stood in ranks of gold and black, while ministers knelt and argued themselves toward blasphemy. Some cried that the beast was a demon beyond classification and must be met with the rites reserved for breaches in the veil. Others said it was no demon, for no warp sign accompanied its coming, and what approached the throne sector did so with the mute inevitability of astronomy. One old confessor, who had survived 6 purges by never mistaking piety for truth, whispered that perhaps the empire had mistaken itself for eternal law, and now true law had arrived to correct the error. He was executed before he finished breathing the thought. Outside, the Titan reached the Meridian Gate. That gate had been raised from the fused bones of conquered moons and sealed with the blood of the first dynasts. No army had crossed it by force. No siege had so much as chipped its lintel in living memory. Its surface was carved with mankind triumphant over every terror the stars had offered. Before that colossal bronze face the beast halted, and for the first time since its coming, stillness entered its vast body. The fires reflected in its eyes as in old jade. Steam rose from its jaws. The broken city burned around it, and the dead drifted upward in grey sheets through the hot night. Then, with a slowness more dreadful than rage, the creature lowered its head toward the gate, as though regarding an inscription it had seen before, perhaps in another age, perhaps before men had learned to write. And in the deepest vault beneath the throne, something answered from below. Beneath the broken magnificence of the throne sector, where the mountain foundations descended through strata of worked stone, antique ferrocrete, and older materials whose names had been lost to liturgy. There existed another world. It had no windows, no sky, no clocks by which men of the upper realms might reckon it. It was a kingdom of pressure and dust, of corridors hewn when the capital had still been a fortress instead of a shrine, and of chambers sealed not to protect treasure, but to prevent memory from climbing back into the light. As the beast stood before the meridian gate and the dying city burned above, the vaults awakened. At first the change was slight. Ash fell from archways untouched for centuries. The oil in long dead lamps gave a soft convulsion, as if breath had entered the wicks. Bronze masks affixed to the walls, relics of an older rulership, rattled faintly in their sockets. Then came the deeper tremors, measured, immense, rhythmic, not like the random violence of bombardment, but like the answering pulse of some buried organ stirred to function after an age of stone-bound sleep. In the archive of censured origins where entire dynasties of historians had labored only to have their work condemned and entombed, an old man lifted his head from a lectern of black wood. His name had once been Iorvan Hale, royal annotator of the Ninth Chamber, but his titles had been stripped from him years ago, and what remained to him was blindness, exile, and the stewardship of manuscripts no court would acknowledge. His eyes had been burned away in the service of a truth too nearly spoken. The sockets were now covered by thin brass veils engraved with penitential text. He had learned to read with his fingers and to hear the shiver of dust in a room as other men heard weather. He knew the mountain had changed. Around him the archive breathed with long-forgotten mechanisms. Chains inside the walls shifted, locks turned behind stone. On the shelves scroll caskets lacquered in priestly red trembled and slid against one another like teeth chattering in fever. Iorvan rose with the caution of age, one hand upon the lectern, the other extended into the dark as if the air itself might be examined. He listened to the distant bombardment rolling through the foundations, to the groaning of deep metal under strain, and beneath these to something worse, a resonance not made by human craft. It traveled through the floor as if spoken by the world itself. There was another presence in the archive. He smelled iron, lamp smoke, wet wool, and the faint medicinal reek of a healing wound. "You heard it," said a voice from the far aisle. Iorvan did not start. He had been expecting this voice for several nights, though he had not known in what hour it would return. "I hear many things," condemned one. The man who stepped between the shelves wore the torn remains of a war priest's habit over scavenged armor blackened by old fire. His scalp was shaved save for a braid at the crown, now stiff with blood. Across his throat ran the silver brand of doctrinal disgrace, a sigil burned there to mark him unfit for the altar and too dangerous for quick execution. His name was Seradve. Once he had led purgation columns into schismatic worlds and preached obedience amid the thunder of artillery. Then he had stood in a burning chapel on a conquered moon and refused to order the slaughter of children declared contaminated by proximity to heresy. For that hesitation, which the Empire judged a softness more poisonous than treason, he had been sent below to await eventual usefulness in darkness. "The mountain is answering," Serad said. "The mountain remembers," Iorvan replied. Another tremor passed through the chamber, stronger now. Above them, or far beyond them, a sound like the bending of colossal bronze rolled down through the vault shafts. Dust drifted across Iorvan's hands. Somewhere beyond the archive walls, old engines coughed themselves awake. Serad crossed to the central table and laid upon it a copper cylinder sealed with wax gone white from age. "I took this from the Chamber of Buried Maps," he said. The seals were already broken. Iorvan touched the cylinder and felt carved into it a line of symbols so ancient that even their ceremonial copies had become distorted by theology. He drew a slow breath. "This should not be here. Nothing that should not be here remains above us tonight." The old man broke the wax. Inside was not a map but a sheaf of thin metal leaves, each etched with minute script and diagrams so dense they resembled woven cloth. He traced the first lines with reverent fingertips. As he read, his expression altered, not into fear, but into the sorrow of recognition. "These are pre-dynastic surveys," he murmured, "from before the first throne city, before sanctification, before the mountain was remade." Serad waited. The deep resonance in the floor grew steadier, pulsing like a heart too large for flesh. "What do they say?" he asked. Iorvan's hands moved across the metal leaves. He read in silence for a time, lips tightening as he passed from line to line. Then he spoke as one reciting not words but a sentence pronounced long ago and only now made audible. This was not the first capital built here, nor the second. The mountain is artificial in part. The foundations were raised around an object brought from the eastern abyssal trench in the Elder Age. He paused. Not an idol, not a weapon in the common sense, a chamber, a vessel. Serad said nothing. From somewhere down the corridor came a low groan as a great stone door unsealed itself grain by grain. The records state that the vessel emitted waves of force which altered dreams, memory, and appetite for worship. Iorvan continued. Those who found it believed it could gather reverence and convert it into stability, into political continuity, into obedience that outlived kings. So they entombed it beneath the first citadel and built each empire atop the last, feeding the thing with ceremony until no one remembered there was anything there to feed. The war priest's scarred mouth hardened. A foundation made of hunger, a throne often is. Another shock struck the archive. Shelves toppled in the eastern aisle. Scroll caskets burst open across the floor, spilling fragments of prohibited histories in every script mankind had buried. Lamps flared blue, then green. The old mountain resonance rose until the metal leaves on the table began to sing. Serad drew the pistol at his hip, though neither man knew at what target such a weapon could be aimed. And the beast above. Iorvan touched the last diagram and withdrew his hand as though from a wound. The surveyors named what they dragged from the trench by a title now erased from doctrine. I can still read the scar beneath the censorship. He lifted his ruined face toward the ceiling, toward the burning city, toward the creature at the gate. It means, in the oldest form, the lure that calls the abyss to shore. Beyond the archive, from a depth still lower than either man had ever been permitted to descend, there came the sound of a lock turning for the first time in ages beyond counting. And both of them understood that whatever stood at the Meridian Gate might not have come to conquer the throne world at all. It might merely have come to answer something already waiting beneath it. Above the innermost sanctum, the palace burned in tears. The outer courts had become furnaces open to the poisoned sky. Domes plated in devotional gold sagged and tore, spilling molten rivers through colonnades where martyr kings had once been crowned beneath canopies of incense. Statues of conquerors leaned and fell in slow magnificence, their bronze faces softening in the green light until they resembled the dead they had claimed to rule. Across the shattered terraces, the beast moved with the patience of a continent. Each step sent through the mountain a decree felt more deeply than heard. Stone remembered it. Metal submitted to it. The old world, built layer upon layer over concealed dread, began at last to confess the burden it had hidden. Yet at the center of that inferno there remained one chamber where ceremony still endured. The Sanctum Imperialis was buried beneath vaults of auric adamant and shielded by engines so ancient that their architects had been canonized into abstraction. Within it, light did not descend from lamp or sun. It issued from the machinery itself, from pylons engraved with unending litanies, from vast halo rings spinning in pain-bound precision, from capillaries of white fire coursing through conduits thicker than tree trunks. The air smelled of sacred oils, cauterized flesh, and the metallic sweetness of ceaseless electricity. Here time had long ago ceased to behave as it did elsewhere. Days and centuries alike had been consumed by maintenance, by prayer, by the labor of prolonging a single impossible stillness. Upon the throne sat the emperor. He was less a man than a persistence. His body, reduced by ages of enthronement, remained sheathed in dim gold and relic gauze, its outline preserved by mechanisms that fed into spine, skull, and withered heart. The face, once cast on coinage and painted in victory chapels across a million worlds, had become difficult to behold, not because it was grotesque, though it was that also, but because it held too many histories in too little flesh. The mouth was closed. The lids over the eyes had long since sealed like the petals of a dead flower, yet the entire empire still arranged its breath around that silence. Generations had risen and perished interpreting it. Wars had been launched to defend what it refused to explain. Faith had hardened around muteness until muteness itself became doctrine. Now the silence was under assault. Around the throne stood the custodians of the inner radiance, giants armored in black gold plate, etched with prayers so small they could be read only with lenses. Their helms were bare, for they had been taught that to shield the face from the sovereign's presence was to admit fear. They did not fear, they had been remade past fear. But something had entered them with the trembling of the palace foundations, and what moved there was more ancient than terror. It was recognition without understanding, as when hounds raise their heads at the smell of a storm carried from lands no map remembers. Beyond them gathered the councils of emergency, priest archons, war marshals, keepers of succession, lords of the signal crypts, and the gaunt masters of the throne engines, who seldom left their machinery long enough to remember that other men possessed skin. They had come draped in office and ash. Some still wore blood from the dead above. Others smelled of smoke, salt water, and ruptured sanctifier fluid. All of them spoke, because speech was the only power still available to them. "It is a breach event," declared Hierophant Malrek, his many rosaries blackened by heat. "No material organism can withstand the magnitude of that descent. It is a spirit cloaked in flesh. Open the interdiction reliquaries. Prepare the soul-flensing rites." "No warp corruption has manifested," replied Admiral Serevan of the Crown Ring, his voice raw from hours of command. "The augur's red mass. Heat, radiation, pressure. It can be wounded. It bleeds. We require remaining orbital fire control, not scripture. Your fire control has already failed, because the lower relays have been severed, because your faith was insufficient, because your faith cannot strike a target." So they contended before the silent throne, while the world beyond them died. They disputed cause, category, precedence, and jurisdiction. They flung accusation as drowning men fling hands toward drifting wreckage. Each required that the event fit a doctrine, for if it did not, then doctrine itself had become another ruin in need of burial. Only the master of the veiled engines did not speak. He was ancient even among the sanctum's ministers, a figure bound into a cradle of mechanical limbs, his own wasted body suspended within a cage of bronze vertebrae. Tubes entered his neck and disappeared into the throne's lower manifold. He had not slept without narcotic intervention in 80 years. He watched the arguments with eyes clouded by stimulants and revelation. At length he said, "Listen." No one obeyed at first. The chamber was too full of rank and panic. Then the floor trembled again, more violently than before. The halo rings above the sovereign's head wavered in their rotation. A rain of golden dust fell from the highest vault. Somewhere within the walls a choir conduit burst, releasing a thin human scream that continued until steam drowned it. "Listen," the engine master repeated. The chamber stilled. Then they heard it. Not the distant bombardment, not the rolling collapse of the palace, but another sound carried through the throne itself. It came from deep within the sovereign's machinery, from chambers sealed behind sanctified casings and layers of taboo. It was a pulse, deliberate and slow, answering the rhythm that had begun below the mountain. With each recurrence, faint green veins appeared in the white light flowing through the conduits. The radiance of the sanctum was being touched from elsewhere. The Hierophant drew back as if struck. Blasphemy. The engine master did not turn toward him. No. Design. The word hung in the air like an executioner's blade. He extended one trembling mechanical limb toward a bank of cipher tablets no uninitiated hand had touched in centuries. Glyphs awakened across their surfaces. Old command streams, buried under dynasties of liturgical revision, pushed upward through the systems of the throne like bones surfacing through shallow graves. Most were unreadable. Some had been deliberately overwritten by piety. Yet enough remained for horror. "The lower architecture is not reactive," he whispered. "It is responsive. The foundational lattice is receiving a signal and returning one." "From what source?" asked a custodian, and for the first time in living memory there was uncertainty in such a voice. The engine master's fingers hovered over the glyphs. Not from above. At that same moment, beyond the sanctum's sealed gates, the meridian gate failed. The noise reached them not as a crash but as a prolonged metallic lament, the death cry of an object that had believed itself eternal. The blast doors shuddered inward, their embedded saints split from brow to breast. Along the seams rushed heat, emerald light, and the smell of sea depths opened after ages beneath stone. The beast had crossed the final threshold. The councils fell to their knees, some in prayer, some because their legs had ceased to serve them. The custodians lowered their guardian spears. The engine master stared at the silent sovereign, and in that ravaged face he sought some sign that all the ages of obedience had not been offered to vacancy. The emperor did not move. He did not speak. Yet as the green light entered the sanctum and mingled with the white fire of the throne, the dead mouth seemed for an instant less like the seal of divine patience than the mark of an old defeat never confessed. And those who knelt before him understood, each according to the measure of his courage, that silence might not always be majesty. Sometimes it was concealment, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes the last defense of a power that had once promised to save the world and had instead taught it how to wait for ruin. When the meridian gate gave way and the green light entered the palace, the custodians of the inner radiance did not retreat. They had not been made for retreat. Each of them had been taken in infancy from lines of carefully measured blood, built into stature by discipline, surgery, and sacrament, and taught that his life was a wall set between the throne and the end of all human order. For 3 centuries and more, Arcturus Vale had stood among them, his spear upright in the sanctum glow, his face uncovered before the dying sovereign, his thoughts trained into a stillness almost equal to worship. He had killed princes, saints, warlords, and things that had once worn the shape of men. Yet never in all those centuries had he felt the palace itself become foreign beneath his feet. The floor still trembled with the tread of the beast beyond the sanctum. Green fire pulsed through the seams of the blast doors. The ministers argued in lower voices now, as if loudness itself had become a kind of heresy. The master of the veiled engines continued to draw ancient signals from the buried architecture, his machine limbs shaking with strain. It was he who turned his clouded eyes toward Arcturus and spoke the order no one else present had the courage to give voice. "The response rises from beneath the throne," he said. "If there is a route to this calamity, it lies below. One of you must descend." No one looked at the emperor. No sign came from the withered figure upon the seat of gold and agony. White fire climbed through the throne conduits and returned streaked with faint jade, as though the palace had been pierced by some deeper circulatory system and now bled in mixed colors. Arcturus stepped forward before any rival claim or caution could take shape. He did not kneel. Custodians knelt to the throne itself and to nothing else. He struck the butt of his guardian spear once upon the floor in acknowledgement, turned, and walked toward the rear apse where the old access shafts descended beneath the sanctum. 2 others moved as if to join him, but the engine master raised a shaking hand. "One only," he said. "The lower wards are waking in patterns I do not trust. Too much force may trigger seals we cannot reopen." Arcturus went alone. The apse door yielded to his gene mark and ancient rank. Beyond it lay a spiral descent. None but the deepest palace servants remembered still existed. The first stair was of gold-veined marble, broad enough for ceremonial passage, but soon the grandeur failed. The walls narrowed, ornament thinned into severity. Marble gave way to black stone, then to an older substance not quite mineral and not wholly metal, cold even in the grip of surrounding fires. The air changed as he descended. Above, the palace smelled of incense, oil, blood, and melting sanctity. Below there was only dust, old iron, and the salt breath of sealed profundities. He carried no lamp. The lenses built into his armor read heat and motion in the dark. Yet as he went deeper, he found such instruments inadequate. The darkness below the throne was not absence but accumulation. It felt layered, sedimented by centuries of decree. The walls were carved in scripts earlier than the dynastic tongue, overwritten by pious chisels, then half erased again by later revisions. At intervals he passed bronze doors engraved with the names of offices abolished so long ago that their titles had become apocrypha. Some stood open now by the width of a finger. Some had buckled outward as if pressure from within had tested them. The tremor in the stone persisted, not random, but paced. Arcturus came at length to the hall of unlit witnesses, a chamber circular and high-roofed, lined with blind masks mounted upon iron spikes. Each mask was human in proportion, but not in expression. Their lips were sealed shut. Their eyes were fashioned as empty wells. He had never seen this place, yet his training whispered of it, an antechamber from the first citadel, preserved beneath later construction because no one had dared destroy what no one understood. At the center of the hall, the floor had split. Through the fracture rose a green luminescence soft as marsh fire. He paused there, not from fear, but to listen. Far below, beyond stone and old machine strata, something immense gave off a slow recurring note, less a sound than a pressure on the bones of the ear. It was being answered. He could feel the reply through the shaft of his spear, which had begun to vibrate so faintly that only hands trained to stillness would have noticed. He descended further. The stair ended in a corridor whose walls were lined with shelves collapsed beneath the weight of rotted caskets and metal leaves. Here the dust was disturbed. Human footsteps, light and recent, crossed the floor. Another set accompanied them, heavier, deliberate. Arcturus followed the tracks until he came upon two figures at the threshold of a half-open vault door, an old blind man with brass veils over his ruined eyes, and beside him a gaunt war priest bearing disgrace upon his throat like a second mouth. Neither reached for a weapon. That alone told Arcturus they understood what kind of death had found them. "You are far beneath your oath, Lord Guardian," said the blind one, "and you are far beyond your sentence," Arcturus replied. The war priest rested a hand near the pistol at his side, though he did not draw it. "If you came to kill us, do it quickly. The mountain has lost interest in law." Arcturus regarded them in silence. In another hour, under another sky, he would indeed have killed them both for trespass in these depths. Yet the green glow beneath the vault threshold painted their faces in corpse light, and the whole palace now stood upon the edge of meanings old law did not contain. "What lies below?" he asked. The blind archivist lifted a sheaf of thin metal leaves. "A chamber entombed before the First Empire, a vessel dredged from the abyssal trench in the Elder Age. The palace was raised over it, then the citadel, then the throne city, then all the succeeding sanctities. It receives devotion and answers with continuity, or so the first rulers believed. Belief does not explain the beast." "No," the old man said softly, "but hunger does, lures do, calls sent out across long dark stew." The floor convulsed beneath them. This time the tremor came with a crack like the snapping of a planet-sized bone. The half-open vault door flew wide. A wind rushed upward from below, cold and wet and burdened with a smell older than oceans under sunlight. Arcturus stepped before the two condemned men by instinct alone. Spear level, armor servos locking for impact. None came. Instead there rose from the abyss beneath the vault a light unlike the beast's destructive radiance. This one was greener, dimmer, and more intimate, as if shaped not for war but for beckoning. It filled the shaft below with a marine glow, and revealed, far down, a geometry impossible to measure at a glance, terraces, pylons, and curved surfaces of black stone clasping a central object, vast as a buried cathedral heart. Arcturus saw then that the thing below was not dormant machinery, nor shrine, nor tomb. It was an opened chamber of deliberate design, and around it moved shadows too large to belong to any man. The war priest whispered a prayer that had no place in approved books. The old archivist bowed his veiled face, not in reverence but in the posture of one who hears at last the approach of a truth for which he has already been punished. Arcturus took one step toward the abyss. From somewhere in the green depths something stepped upward to meet him. What rose from the abyss beneath the throne was not a beast in the image of the one that had broken the palace gates, nor any engine fashioned by forgotten sovereigns to guard their hidden foundations. It came upward as a procession of forms half seen through the green marine light, and each form seemed at first to resemble a man until the eye, compelled to linger, perceived how profoundly that resemblance had been abandoned. Their limbs were too long and jointed with an elegance no terrestrial bloodline had earned. Their heads were smooth and narrow, crowned with translucent crests within which pale currents moved like trapped tides. Their flesh, if flesh it was, shone with the wet luster of stone brought from great depth. Over their chests and shoulders clung filaments of black metal etched with signs not written but grown, as if language itself had learned to calcify. There were 3 of them. They mounted the stair carved into the shaft wall with a gliding patience that made the labor of ascent appear ceremonial rather than necessary. No weapon showed in their hands, no haste marked them. Yet the air changed around their approach. It grew colder and denser, and with that pressure came an assault upon the inward faculties more dreadful than any visible threat. Arcturus Vale, whose mind had been layered with disciplines against fear, temptation, and psychic trespass, felt old images stirring where no image should have survived, seas he had never seen, moons hanging over black waters, towers of bone-white stone beneath a green aurora, and lines of kneeling figures so numerous they became a texture upon the shore. The visions carried no command, only a weight of antiquity so immense that his own centuries of service seemed no more than sparks thrown from a forge and gone. The blind archivist bent, one hand pressed to the stone. Blood ran from beneath the brass veils over his eyes. The war priest Seredve drew a ragged breath and mouthed prayers without sound, his branded throat working as if the old disgrace there had awakened to answer another, deeper condemnation. The foremost of the ascending figures halted at the edge of the vault threshold. In the green light, its face possessed neither cruelty nor mercy. The features were too spare for human categories. Where men carried expression like weather across the skin, this being wore stillness as an element of its structure, yet it was not lifeless. Beneath the translucence of its crest, the pale currents quickened, the long fingers of one hand opened slightly, not in threat, but in some old gesture of address. Then the sermon began. No mouth moved, no sound traveled through the air. The words entered each mind by the route reserved for memory, as though recalled rather than heard. They came not in the dynastic tongue, nor in the liturgical registers shaped by empire, but in a conceptual speech older than either, translated by the listener's own depths into forms it could bear. Thus the three men at the threshold received one message in three different agonies. To Arcturus came the language of oath. He perceived an age before the throne city, before the palace, before the first sanctified banners had risen above the mountain. He saw men of immense ambition dredging the abyssal trench and exulting when they found beneath the ocean floor a chamber that answered thought with stability. Not wisdom, not justice. Stability. They fed it rites, submission, bloodlines, repetitive devotion, and in return it made continuity possible. Kingdom followed kingdom without fully dying. Dynasties decayed, yet their central structure endured. Rebellion flared and was consumed. The world learned how to persist by kneeling. From this bargain all later order had grown, and within the revelation came another certainty, harder than steel. The custodians themselves had not been made merely to guard the sovereign upon the throne. They had been fashioned, whether knowingly or not, to defend the bargain from interruption. To Iorvan Hale came the language of record. He saw lines of script erased, palimpsests of doctrine layered over censored maps, councils of priest-kings choosing amnesia as the first act of government. He saw chronicles burned not because they were false, but because they were precise. He saw his own life, his blinding, his exile among the condemned manuscripts, as part of a much longer reflex by which the empire preserved itself through the mutilation of memory. Yet what most wounded him was not the corruption of historians or the vanity of rulers. It was the vision of how often men had glimpsed the truth and turned away because the truth offered no flattering role for human grandeur. It said only this, that civilization had built its altar over a lure and had mistaken the arrival of gathered predators for divine confirmation. To Sirad Vey came the language of guilt. He saw countless pyres, sieges and purgations through the eyes not of the executioner or the condemned, but of the machine beneath them all. It had received every prayer that accompanied slaughter. It had drunk every oath spoken over mass graves. It had taken holy war, civic reverence, grief, obedience and ecstatic cruelty alike, reducing each to the same nutritive current. Nothing in the empire's moral distinctions had mattered to it. Innocent and guilty, saint and butcher, child and marshal, all had fed the hidden continuity. Sirad felt then the full obscenity of the order he had served. Not that it had sinned, for all empires sin, but that it had transformed sin itself into infrastructure. The being at the threshold lowered its hand, and the pressure of revelation deepened. Images passed through them with the inevitability of tides. The abyssal chamber below the mountain had not been built by men. It was older than the current species of the world, perhaps older than the world's present oceans. It had been cast upward once from some remote war among stars or gods, then buried in sediment until human ambition found it and named its utility providence. Yet the chamber had never been alone. Across gulfs of time and dark, its emissions had continued, signals of accumulation, patterns of dominance, concentrations of worship and extractive rule. Such concentrations called to something, not in anger, not in vengeance, in accordance. The beast above was one answer among many possible answers. At this, Arcturus clenched his spear until the haft groaned beneath armored fingers. The green sermon did not praise the Titan, it did not condemn mankind. It simply placed each within a sequence more terrible for lacking hatred. Civilizations rose around lures, power fed hidden mechanisms. Those mechanisms radiated through void and deep. Eventually something vast arrived to close the circuit. The coming was not punishment, only completion. The custodian stepped forward then, one pace, placing himself between the threshold and the two unaugmented men behind him. Duty had survived revelation, perhaps duty was all that survived it. If this is truth, he said, and this time his words were his own, harsh in the damp green air, why speak it now? The being regarded him. For the first time, something like sadness entered the currents within its crest, because the answer came, not in language but in certitude. The chamber is opening. Far below them the abyssal light flared. The shaft walls trembled. Deep mechanisms boomed awake in concentric waves. Beneath the threshold, from the unseen terraces surrounding the buried vessel, other lights kindled one after another in widening circles, as if an entire architecture submerged under ages of empire had just remembered its original purpose. Above, through layers of stone and sanctified ruin, there came a distant shock so vast that even the sermon fractured beneath it. The beast had entered the inner palace. The three ascending beings turned their heads upward in unison, listening. Then, from the depths below the mountain, a second pulse answered the first, stronger, nearer, and unmistakably alive, and for the first time since the night began, even the heralds of the abyss seemed uncertain what else had awakened with the chamber. The second pulse did not belong to the chamber. That truth moved through the depths beneath the throne before any voice dared shape it. It rolled outward from below the abyssal terraces in slow concentric waves, setting the black stone to trembling and turning the green light in the shaft to a liquid shudder. The herald beings at the vault threshold drew back by the breadth of a hand. It was little enough in distance, yet in creatures so composed it bore the weight of alarm. Arcturus Vale saw it and understood that whatever doctrine the abyss had brought with it, doctrine had now encountered surprise. From far above came the laboring groan of the palace as the Titan entered deeper courts. Great masses of sanctified architecture failed one upon another, the noise descending through bedrock as if mountains were being fed, piece by piece into a furnace. Dust drifted in grey veils through the shaft light. Behind Arcturus, the blind archivist Iorvan Hale steadied himself with one hand on the wall, while Serad Vey stood rigid, not from courage, but from the kind of attention men grant a blade as it approaches the throat. Then the floor of the lower vault opened, not by explosion, nor by rupture under stress, but by intention. Around the central shaft, ancient seams became visible in the black stone, traced first in dim viridian lines, then in full radiance. Vast sections of flooring rotated inward and slid apart without sound, revealing beneath them an amphitheater of descending rings. Terraces sank away into marine darkness, each ring cut with symbols too large to be words and too ordered to be ornament. At the center lay the buried vessel around which the First Empire had raised its deceitful crown. Seen fully at last, it resembled neither altar nor engine. It was shaped like an immense ovoid chamber clasped within braces of unknown metal, half submerged in a basin of black fluid that reflected no light. Its surface was smooth in some places, ridged in others, like a seed grown from mineral lore rather than flesh. Cracks had appeared across it. From those cracks issued the green luminescence that had filled the shaft, as though something within had pressed for ages against a shell now losing the strength to deny it. The herald beings descended first, gliding from stair to terrace with a solemnity no longer free of tension. Arcturus followed by a narrower stair carved into the wall, his guardian spear held low, his armored tread sounding with brutal clarity in that awakened place. The archivist and the war priest came after him because there was nowhere else left to go. Above them was a palace in ruin. Below was the truth it had entombed. Men often imagine revelation as a summit. More often it is a staircase leading down. As they descended, the visions returned. They came not now as the sermon had come, in ordered concepts and merciless comprehension, but in flashes torn loose by the pulse rising from beneath the vessel. Whole ages spilled across the inward eye, shores beneath green auroras, armies kneeling before monoliths taller than cathedral spires, cities built in rings around black inland seas where no wind stirred. Then war, the sky burning with geometries of impossible fire, colossal things moving in orbit like knives around a throat, and beneath them the old chamber kindred casting their signals into the dark in patterns of summons, defense, dominion. Arcturus felt no clear chronology in it. Time in those images folded upon itself like metal under enormous pressure. Whatever civilization had birthed, the vessel had not merely ruled worlds. It had woven obedience into the fabric of matter and called that weaving peace. At the sixth terrace, the party halted. Before them stood pillars that had not been visible from above, 12 in number, half sunk into the amphitheater floor and leaning inward over the central basin. Within each pillar drifted a shape suspended in green suspension light. The first appeared empty until the eye adjusted. Then the human outline declared itself, elongated, spare, wrapped in remnants of ceremonial armor corroded almost into lace. In the second floated another, in the third, another still, a ring of dead witnesses, or wardens, or sacrifices. Their faces had withered into masks of perfect composure. Iorvan touched one pillar with trembling fingers. "Not dead when enclosed," he whispered. Serad stared at the nearest face, whose closed eyes had not fully decayed. "Entombed alive." "No," said one of the herald beings, and for the first time it spoke aloud. The voice was low and resonant, as though shaped by a chest made for greater pressures than air. It spoke the dynastic tongue with grave precision, each syllable slightly burdened by translation. Listening, the words settled over them with the force of blasphemy. Arcturus looked from the pillar to the vessel in the basin. The cracks across its shell had widened. Between them something moved in shadow, vast and slow, as if turning in constrained sleep. To what? The herald being regarded him. To the call they made. It lifted one narrow hand toward the dead ring. To the answer they feared. Then the third pulse came. This time it struck like the blow of a submerged bell. The black fluid in the basin heaved upward. The pillars flashed from within, illuminating their ancient occupants in stark emerald relief. Several of the entombed figures opened their eyes. Serad uttered a hoarse prayer and drew his pistol. Iorvan bowed his head, not in worship, but in despair. Arcturus planted his spear and lowered his stance as if the whole buried age might at any moment charge up from the basin. Within the vessel, the moving shadow pressed harder against the cracked shell. Above, through leagues of stone, the Titan roared at last. It was not the cry of a beast defending territory, nor of a god enraged by defiance. It was deeper than anger, older than triumph. The sound carried through the mountain and into the chamber below as recognition made audible. At its passing, the black fluid in the basin broke into concentric ripples. The entombed listeners in the pillars opened their mouths in unison, though no breath emerged. The herald beings went still as carved saints. Arcturus felt the answer before he understood it. The thing within the vessel had heard the roar and knew it. A fissure split the shell from crown to base. Green brilliance flooded the amphitheater. For one brief, merciless instant, every shape in the chamber became absolute. The leaning pillars, the dead listeners, the veiled archivist, the condemned priest, the abyssal envoys, and at the center of all, a silhouette unfurling inside the light with limbs too many and a head crowned in tidal fire. Then the mountain shook so violently that the terrace beneath them cracked open, and the first fragment of the waking thing rose through the broken shell like a hand remembering how to claim the world. The hand that rose from the broken vessel was not a hand as men understood the word. It had too many joints and no visible nails, its long fingers tapering into translucent blades that refracted the green light into wavering bands across the terraces. Between those fingers hung membranes fine as drowned silk, and within the membranous tissue faint constellations of pale fire drifted like captive stars. The limb emerged slowly, not with the violence of a creature forcing birth through stone, but with the grave certainty of something answering an hour-long appointed. Black fluid poured from it in sheets. Where those drops struck the amphitheater floor, old scripts flared and died. Arcturus' veil moved before thought completed itself. His spear came up in a single motion, point leveled toward the ascending shape. The terrace beneath his feet was still cracking, sections of black stone slipping inward toward the basin. Behind him, Serad dragged the blind archivist back from a widening fissure, boots scraping over dust and ancient debris. The herald beings did not interfere. They stood in a half-circle along the lower ring, their smooth faces turned toward the vessel with a stillness that resembled dread disciplined into ritual. The shell split further. What emerged was not merely immense. It possessed the kind of scale that dissolved familiar judgments. In the green brilliance pouring from the broken vessel, the thing unfurling within seemed at once too vast for the chamber, and yet somehow appropriate to it, as though the whole abyssal architecture had been nothing but a folded organ built around its long confinement. A crowned head rose next, narrow and faceted, with no mouth visible at first, only layered plates that shifted over one another like tidal shelves in moon-driven motion. Along the neck ran veins of pale luminosity. Then came shoulders, if shoulders they could be called, and from them descended additional limbs that folded close to the torso like ceremonial appendages kept in reserve. It was not kin to the Titan above in shape, yet Arcturus understood at once why the beast in the palace had roared in recognition. The likeness between them was not bodily but ancient. Each belonged to a magnitude before which empire became provincial. Each had been shaped by laws older than human kingship. One had walked from the sea under a burning sky. The other had waited beneath the mountain, listening through ages of worship and slaughter for the moment when the circuit would close. The first true sound the buried Titan made was a breath. The air in the amphitheater convulsed inward. Dust, loose stone, fragments of vessel shell, even the black fluid in drifting strands were drawn toward the creature's chest, as if gravity had briefly shifted allegiance. The ring of entombed listeners in their green-lit pillars opened their mouths wider. A tone issued from them then, thin and many-layered, not spoken, not sung, but resonant with unbearable purpose. It was a chord of reception, an opening, a key turned in a lock older than mankind's memory. "No," whispered Iorvan Hale, though whether in protest or comprehension even he could not have known. The buried Titan's head turned. It did not turn toward Arcturus first, nor toward the heralds who had descended to attend its waking. It turned toward the old archivist. Beneath the translucent crown, lights moved in patterns too complex for thought to hold. The faceted head inclined, measuring the blind man not as prey or servant, but as one might measure a document preserved unexpectedly through fire. Iorvan's brass-veiled face lifted under that regard. Blood ran freely now from beneath the metal covers over his ruined eyes. "It knows the keepers of memory," he said, his voice scarcely more than breath. "Or the thieves of it," Serad answered. Arcturus descended 3 steps toward the basin, armor groaning, spear steady. "Name yourself." The command rang through the chamber in the old martial register, the voice of the palace addressing any unknown presence within its law. Yet the law sounded diminished here. Even Arcturus heard it. The creature did not answer in words. Instead, the entire amphitheater replied. Across the black stone rings, symbols blazed one after another in widening spirals. The floor beneath Arcturus's boots thrummed with such force that his teeth ached inside his skull. The ring of pillars flashed from within, revealing the entombed listeners in perfect detail. Their garments, once regal, were now nearly dissolved. Their flesh had thinned against bone, yet their eyes, though fixed in death, burned with lucid green. Through them came another wave of memory, not shaped for persuasion as the sermon had been, but released by proximity and impossible to refuse. He saw the abyssal civilization in its age of confidence, gathered in amphitheaters like this one beneath worlds whose names had been ground to dust by time. He saw them raise vessels into orbit and lower chambers into trenches, seeding planets with structures tuned to receive reverence, hierarchy, and repetition. Not all such structures were alike. Some gathered prayer, some gathered grief, some gathered conquest. The one beneath the throne had gathered continuity at the cost of truth. The species that built them had learned that power could be stabilized by making societies orbit a concealed appetite. They had called this wisdom. Their enemies had called it enslavement. Wars beyond numbering followed. In the end, both names had perished, but the chambers remained, patient as geology. Arcturus staggered 1 pace, not from fear but from the insult done to scale. Everything human seemed suddenly derivative. The buried Titan rose higher. Its lower body remained clasped within the shattered vessel, but already its crown neared the leaning ring of pillars. The additional limbs along its flanks unfolded and touched the basin's rim with exquisite care, as if reacquainting themselves with weight. Where the translucent blades of its fingers met stone, the ancient scripts awakened in white-green fire. The herald beings bowed then, not in adoration but in formal recognition of rank returned from exile. Above them the palace convulsed again. A rain of grit and powdered masonry fell through hidden shafts. The Titan in the upper world moved somewhere directly overhead, and its tread was now accompanied by another sound, the prolonged scream of overburdened throne engines being forced past all sanctified tolerances. The 2 immensities, one above and one below, were drawing into relation through the body of the mountain itself. Serad Vey raised his pistol at the buried creature, though the gesture was so hopeless it became almost noble. "If it reaches the upper vaults, it was always in the upper vaults," Iorvan said. "We only gave the lie more flaws." Arcturus did not lower his weapon. Duty held him upright when comprehension could not. "Can it be contained?" One of the herald beings looked toward him, and in its grave, sea-depth face there was the shadow of pity. "Contained," it said, was the first error. Then the buried Titan opened the layered plates of its face, and at the center there appeared not a mouth, but a chamber of revolving green light within which floated a single dark sphere, dense as a starless sun. The air in the amphitheater bent toward it. Stone groaned. The black fluid in the basin lifted in trembling columns. Every implanted sense within Arcturus's armored body screamed warning. Far above, the beast in the palace answered with another roar. And from the hidden heart of the throne, white fire suddenly turned the color of drowned emerald. When the white fire of the throne turned emerald, every sanctified circuit in the palace answered. The change did not begin as an explosion. It moved first as corruption through purity, a tint entering the immaculate radiance vein by vein, until the channels that had glowed for centuries with sacrificial brilliance now burned with the color of drowned depths. The halo rings above the emperor's ruinous seat faltered in their revolutions, then resumed in a slower measure, no longer singing the shrill metallic harmonics of imperial continuity, but a lower resonance that trembled in stone and marrow alike. Along the vaults of the sanctum, litanies hammered in gold leaf, blackened at the edges, and then shone green from within, as if the language of dominion had become translucent and revealed a second scripture beneath itself. The ministers and priests who crowded the chamber did not understand what they were seeing, but their bodies understood before their minds dared follow. Some cried out and covered their eyes. Some collapsed where they knelt, foreheads striking the floor in convulsions of worship or panic impossible to distinguish. One of the signal masters tore the transmitting needles from his own scalp and screamed that the palace was speaking in a voice older than mankind. Another began to laugh with the dry, hopeless cadence of a man who has discovered that blasphemy had been built into the altar from the first stone. He was cut down by a custodian before the sound fully left his throat. The master of the veiled engines remained bound within his bronze support cradle before the throne, his dim eyes reflecting the emerald conversion of the machinery he had served longer than many dynasties had endured. He moved his mechanical limbs over the cipher tablets in frantic, reverent motions, not to stop the change now, but to witness its structure. Streams of buried commands poured upward from the lower architecture. Some were ancient regulatory sequences, some were invitation forms, some were recognitions, preserved in dead protocol, and now reanimated. The throne was not resisting the abyssal signal, it was harmonizing with it. No, Hierophant Malrek whispered, staggering backward, his incense chains clattering against his blackened breastplate. No consecration may be performed without the sovereign will. The engine master did not look at him. It is being performed by the will beneath the sovereign. At that, even the custodians flinched, not outwardly, for their discipline was too absolute for such visible weakness, but in the minute tightening of stance, in the shift of spear hafts against armored palms, in the sudden awareness that all their centuries of guarding may have been a rite of accompaniment rather than protection. Above the sanctum doors, seals burst in showers of molten gold. Heat came in waves from the inner palace, where the sea-born titan advanced through collapsing halls. Yet the greater transformation was not advancing from outside, it was ascending from below. Far beneath, in the abyssal amphitheater, the buried titan lifted higher from the vessel shell. Arcturus Vale felt the mountain between himself and the sanctum cease to be a boundary. Through the green chamber within the creature's face, through the dark sphere suspended at its center, there now flowed a current that linked the buried architecture to the throne above, as nerve joins limb. Every old script on the amphitheater rings blazed. The entombed listeners in their translucent pillars trembled with awakening resonance, their dead mouths still open in that impossible communal note. Around the terraces, the herald beings lowered themselves to one knee, not in surrender but in acknowledgement of a process too vast to interrupt. The buried titan extended one of its many jointed arms toward the vault roof. It did not touch stone, it touched function. The gesture alone sent a vertical beam of green radiance upward through the mountain, narrow as a spear but immeasurable in depth. Rock, metal, catacomb, reliquary vault, transit shaft, engine chamber, and sanctified crypt were all traversed without resistance. Arcturus saw no physical tunneling. Instead, the beam moved through those layers as if each had long ago been prepared to admit it. Where it passed, hidden conduits awakened, dormant nodes answered. Sealed gates unlocked not by pressure, but by consent embedded in design from a forgotten age. Iorvan Hale fell to both knees on the terrace, his brass-veiled face raised toward the ascending beam. All these centuries, he said, not to the others but to the dead builders of the world. All these centuries we thought the throne was feeding the empire. Serad Vey stood beside him, pistol lowered now in stunned irrelevance. It was feeding the root. The archivist bowed his head, and the root has flowered. In the sanctum above, the beam emerged through the floor before the throne itself. Stone that had never known fracture opened in a perfect circle. No debris flew, no violence attended it. The floor simply yielded, petal-like, around the ascending emerald column. It rose before the emperor's seat and passed through the air with such force of presence that every lamp guttered and then steadied in green. The withered sovereign upon the throne remained motionless, but all the machinery sustaining him responded. Conduits swelled with mixed white and emerald fire. Pain engines altered their cadence. Ancient restraints, thought purely mechanical by generations of priest engineers, loosened and reconfigured like the limbs of sleeping insects. Then the beam touched the throne. No blast followed, no firestorm consumed the chamber. Instead there came a silence so total that the roar of the upper titan, the collapse of burning galleries, the shouted orders of terrified ministers, even the pulse of blood in living ears, all seemed withdrawn by some immense hand. In that silence, every person in the sanctum beheld according to the truth he could bear. Some saw the emperor crowned anew in sea-green flame, not diminished but translated, his long muteness vindicated at last as the prelude to a hidden apotheosis. They fell prostrate and wept in gratitude. Some saw only a corpse upon a machine, exposed at last by a light that did not honor it. These either fainted, screamed, or tore out their own tongues before such knowledge could become confession. Some, rarer and more wretched, saw both things at once, that the sovereign had indeed once been great, perhaps greater than any among them had imagined, and that greatness itself had entered into compromise so ancient and desperate that all later sanctity had been built atop its concealment. The master of the veiled engines gazed longest. In the shifting green and white radiance, his old eyes widened with the final lucidity of a man allowed one perfect understanding before death. Not enthroned, he whispered, interfaced. The emperor's sealed eyelids opened. No flesh should have permitted it after so many ages, yet they opened. Beneath them were not human eyes, nor empty sockets, but reservoirs of green-white brilliance within which patterns turned like submerged constellations. A sound came from the dead mouth then, not speech, not command, but the first exhalation of a body re-entered by function after centuries of sacrificial suspension. Every custodian in the chamber lowered his spear point by a hair's breadth, not in attack, not in submission, in uncertainty. Below, Arcturus felt the buried titan's attention sharpen upward with terrible intimacy. Above, beyond the sanctum walls, the sea-born titan struck the palace again, and this time the blow was answered from within the throne itself. The emerald column flared, and across the whole palace mountain, every bell, every shrine lamp, every war engine, every burial mask, and every hidden circuit began to ring in one vast involuntary litany. It was not prayer, it was recognition. And on the throne, in the light of an altar older than empire, the emperor drew a second breath. When the emperor drew his second breath, the palace ceased to be a palace and became an instrument. Its miles of sanctified corridors, chapel spines, reliquary chambers, engine crypts, and throneward ascents all entered one new alignment, as though the mountain beneath had turned upon an axis hidden since the first stones were laid. Bells rang not by rope or mechanism, but by command transmitted through the bones of architecture. Bronze saints opened empty mouths and sang in voices of molten resonance. In the highest galleries, where banners of dead crusades still smoldered amid drifting embers, the very floor mosaics ignited with emerald geometries that no priesthood had ever sanctioned. The palace, long worshipped as the body of empire, confessed itself at last as something more ancient and more obedient than empire had known. Upon the throne, the sovereign moved. It was no grand rising, no resurrection fit for legend adorned the act. The withered body remained bound in its aureate machinery, ribs narrow as cage bars beneath relic cloth, skull haloed by rings still turning in green-white measure, yet motion entered him with a terrible sufficiency. One hand, mummified by centuries of enthronement, tightened upon the arm of the seat until old metal screamed. The head inclined, the opened eyes, those reservoirs of impossible radiance, turned toward the sanctum gates through which the sea-born titan approached. Around him, the custodians of the inner radiance held their ground in a half-circle of black gold majesty, guardian spears leveled, though to what end even they could no longer say. They had defended a silence all their lives. Now speechless action unsettled them more profoundly than any blasphemy. Ministers lay prone. Priests mouthed prayers that had become obsolete in the span of a heartbeat. The master of the veiled engines remained fixed in his bronze cradle, weeping soundlessly as the systems he had served revealed their deeper loyalty. Then the sanctum doors failed inward. They did not shatter at once. They bent first, those enormous slabs of sanctified metal, embossed with creation myths and the victories of early kings. The outlines of their saints bulged, softened and split as heat and pressure entered from beyond. Green fire ran along the seams. The hinges gave with the prolonged wail of an age renouncing itself. Through the breach came a wind heavy with salt, ash, and the chemical stink of vaporized stone. Behind it moved the Titan. Its head entered first, emerging through dust and collapsing goldwork like a mountain advancing through a storm bank. The dorsal spines along its back blazed in sequence, each a serrated sun of emerald force. Fire dripped from its scales, rubble cascaded from its shoulders in cathedral-sized sheets. It had carved its path through the inner palace, with the same inexorable calm it had shown at the gate, but now, before the sanctum and the awakened throne, that calm deepened into attention. The beast lowered its vast head, and its furnace eyes fixed upon the emperor. Thus the two sovereigns regarded one another, one seated upon a machine built to prolong dominion through endless suffering, the other standing amid the ruins of dominion as its living terminus. No herald announced the combat. No challenge was spoken. The age of formalities had already burned away. The Titan's throat brightened. Along its neck and chest, veins of emerald destruction filled and rose toward the jaws. The air between beast and throne convulsed, drawing loose ash and splintered gold into a spiraling current. Before the radiance could spill, the emperor lifted one hand. It was a small movement. The hand that rose was little more than preserved bone armored in rings and tubes. Yet as it rose, the entire sanctum answered. Halo rings accelerated above the throne. The emerald column rising from below widened. Hidden nodes throughout the palace mountain discharged in perfect sequence. A shield formed not before the emperor alone, but through him, a wall of layered green-white force etched with abyssal geometries and overlaid by the thin gold tracery of imperial seals. Both systems fused in reluctant concord. The Titan's beam struck. The sanctum vanished in light. Stone vaporized in arcs. Guardian spears became silhouettes against the brilliance. Every surviving window in the upper palace burst outward in fountains of molten glass. Beyond the sanctum, entire terraces detached and fell into the inferno of the lower city. But within the blast, the shield held. It bowed inward, screaming with stresses no forge-born material could have endured, yet it did not break. The emperor remained upon the throne, his green-white eyes burning brighter as the beam poured against the barrier in a river of apocalypse. Far below, in the abyssal amphitheater, the buried Titan answered. Arcturus Vale saw the thing in the vessel shell lift more of itself into the awakened chamber. The dark sphere within its open facial aperture revolved faster, and from its many-jointed limbs there spread through the mountain a counter-resonance that fed the shield above. The herald beings descended to the lowest ring and touched the black stone with both hands, adding their own grave harmonics to the rising current. The entombed listeners in the pillars glowed with violent life, their preserved eyes open in ancient obligation. The whole abyssal engine beneath the throne had entered battle, not for mankind, not for mercy, but to preserve the completion of whatever circuit now bound the powers above and below. Arcturus felt the structure of the duel in his bones. The emperor did not stand opposed to the abyssal architecture. He stood because it upheld him. The Titan above did not merely seek to kill the sovereign. It sought to break the linkage, to end in one annihilating act, the pact that had allowed this world to become the center of a false eternity. The struggle was not between virtue and monstrosity. It was between two immensities claiming final jurisdiction over a civilization already judged. The beam ceased. The sea-born Titan drew back, smoke pouring from its jaws. Its chest still glowed. The sanctum beyond the shield had become a cavern of slag and drifting cinders. Half the custodians nearest the impact lay ruined, their armor running in black gold streams across the floor. Priests had been reduced to kneeling shadows fused into the stone. Yet the throne endured. The emperor's raised hand remained outstretched, trembling now, not with weakness but with the colossal labor of channeling a power no human body had ever been meant to bear. Then he answered. From the emerald column beneath the throne, from the halo rings, From every sanctified conduit in the palace, from deep mechanisms buried beneath dynasties of worship, there surged a lance of concentrated green-white force, unlike the Titan's raw torrent. This was narrower, colder, shaped with intellect and system. It crossed the sanctum in a line of perfect judgment and struck the beast full in the chest. The Titan reeled. For the first time since it had come from the sea, its composure broke into visible violence. The beam drove it backward through collapsed pillars and burning statuary. One massive claw raked furrows through the sanctum floor as it struggled against the force. The dorsal spines along its back flickered wildly. Chunks of incandescent scale burst from its chest and flew through the palace like meteors. The whole mountain shook with the collision of these opposed authorities. Above the sanctum, the sky split open. Storm clouds, long ago driven aside by bombardment and unnatural heat, now wheeled inward in a vast spiral over the throne sector. Green light reached into their depths. Lightning of no earthly hue crawled between cloud and palace spire. Across the continents, survivors in ruined pilgrim roads and drowned hive districts looked upward and saw the heavens turn as if some invisible hand had begun to unscrew the world from its history. In the abyss below, cracks raced across the terraces. The buried Titan lifted another limb from the vessel shell. Arcturus saw then that its confinement had not merely delayed its waking, it had anchored the mountain itself. If it rose fully, the foundations of the throne might become the foundations of something else. Above, the Emperor's beam faltered for a single fatal instant. The Titan seized that instant. Its jaws opened once more, and this time what gathered in its throat was not only destructive radiance, but recognition sharpened into purpose. The beast had learned where the true wound lay. It lowered its blazing head, not toward the Emperor upon the throne, but toward the emerald column rising from below. And those who witnessed understood that the duel had only pretended, until now, to be fought in the sanctum. The Titan's jaws descended toward the emerald column. It did not fire at once. Instead, it held the gathered radiance within its throat in a slow, deliberate constriction, as a predator holds breath before the final committed strike. The delay was not hesitation, it was precision of the kind that operates beyond instinct, the recognition of a structural weakness too important to miss and too consequential to rush. The column of green-white force connecting throne to abyssal foundation pulsed in long rhythmic intervals like a vein exposed to cold air. Around it, the shattered sanctum lay in its cathedral ruin, and within that ruin the Emperor upon his seat of prolonged agony burned brighter than he had in 1,000 years of silence, which made the fragility of his position all the more terrible to witness. The custodians moved. 4 of them stepped before the column in a line of black gold armor, guardian spears pointed upward toward the Titan's descending jaws. It was a gesture their training had never specifically prepared them for, because their training had never imagined this hour. They had been made to kill men. They had been honed against daemons and rebels. They had never been instructed in how to stand between a god and the machinery that secretly made a god necessary. Yet they stood, because duty in the absence of comprehension is still duty, and because something in the blood of those remade giants refused the concept of yielding. The Titan's beam fell. It did not fall as it had fallen before, in a sustained roar of annihilation. It came in a single concentrated strike aimed past the custodians with the intelligence of something that understood the armor, and the men inside it were equally irrelevant to the true target. The beam struck the column at its midpoint. The column cracked. Green-white fire exploded outward in a disk of force that swept 3 of the custodians from their feet and fused 2 more to the floor in statuary perfection, arms still raised, weapons still extended. The vaulted ceiling collapsed in one long exhalation of masonry. The halo rings above the throne shattered. Silence followed the detonation with the brutal speed of vacuum. Then, from that silence, a new and worse sound ascended. Below the sanctum, through stone and shaft and buried terrace, a great cracking propagated outward from the abyssal amphitheater. The column had not been merely a conduit. It had been the key link in a structure of mutual dependency between the buried vessel, the throne, and the architecture of obedience built atop both. Severed at its middle, neither end could sustain its function. Beneath the mountain, the terraces of the amphitheater fractured in widening rings. The herald beings, struck from their positions at the lowest level, tumbled against the outer wall. The buried Titan, ascending still, lost the channel through which its power had been feeding the sovereign's defense, and tilted against the basin rim with a sound like a continent bending. In the sanctum, the Emperor's fire dimmed. Not extinguished, not yet, but the brilliance in his opened eyes guttered from steady radiance to something older and less certain, like a fire in a window seen from a great distance in bad weather. His raised hand lowered by degrees, the pain engines around the throne accelerated in compensation, forcing continuity through mechanisms never designed for what the last hour had demanded. Their screaming joined the general wreckage of the sanctum in a cacophony of pushed tolerances. Arcturus Vale reached the sanctum from below. He emerged through the broken floor where the column had stood, pulling himself up through the tilted shaft with armored hands, trailing behind him the smoke and emerald residue of the struck conduit. His spear was gone, lost in the concussive wave that had scattered the amphitheater's lower terraces. Of the war priest and the archivist he had left no command, only the recognition that nothing he said could bind men to whom the mountain had confessed its oldest lie. He climbed alone, as he had descended. The sanctum he entered was unrecognizable. The golden throne room of mankind's sovereign age had become a wound in the body of the mountain. Ceiling vaults lay in tremendous shards across the floor. The mosaic saints had been blasted into abstraction. What had been the most heavily defended chamber in all the empire looked, in the green-tinged dark, like the interior of a spent cartridge. The Titan stood at the far breach, its head pulled back from the aftermath of its strike, studying the result. It did not advance immediately. The pause was neither mercy nor satisfaction. It was reading. Arcturus crossed the ruin toward the throne. He passed fallen custodians without pausing to determine which lived, because the sovereign's proximity overrode brotherhood in the hierarchy of obligation he had been built to honor. He passed ministers and priests frozen in postures of final shock. He passed the engine master's bronze cradle, overturned, spilling its ancient occupant against the floor in an attitude of exhausted peace that looked, in the dim light, almost voluntary. He came before the throne and looked up. The emperor looked down. In the opened eyes, now burning at a diminished but still terrible depth, Arcturus searched for recognition, for command, for the ancient and absolute sovereignty his entire existence had been bent toward serving. He found something more difficult. The eyes held consciousness, genuine and immense, but the consciousness carried within it no available instruction, not because the mind was broken, but because the mind, surfacing now from centuries of sacrificial suspension into a clarity it had been denied through the long age of pain engine continuity, was confronting the same truth the rest of the palace had already been forced to swallow. The empire had been built atop a lure. The throne had been the highest chamber of an apparatus designed to gather devotion and convert it into stability. The sovereign had not merely presided over this, he had been inserted into it, perhaps willingly in some forgotten age of dire bargaining, perhaps not. There was no way to read the difference now. What remained was a man of immeasurable power and age, finally awake, finally aware, inhabiting a seat whose purpose he had served without fully knowing, in a palace now half consumed by the arrival of the very reckoning that concealment had deferred. Arcturus took one knee before the throne. He had no words in the approved registers for this moment, because no approved register had anticipated an honest one. He used the oldest form he knew, stripped of all ceremony, the address a soldier gives when ranks and doctrines have been burned away. "Command me." For a long moment the opened eyes held him in their diminished fire. Then slowly, as if unused mechanisms found their way back through the ruin of ceremony, the emperor spoke. His voice was not magnificent, it was simply old, and tired, and present. "There is nothing beneath this throne worth defending." Arcturus did not rise. He remained kneeling while the Titan watched from the far breach, while the mountain trembled with the buried creature's continued ascent, while the last fires of the burning palace played their light across a face that had been worshipped for longer than most civilizations had existed. "Then what remains?" he asked. The emperor's eyes moved, not toward the Titan, not toward the ruined sanctum, but toward the broken floor where the column had stood, toward the depths. "The truth we buried. That is what they came to reclaim." A pause gathered between words like flood water behind a dam. "Let it rise." Arcturus looked toward the Titan. The beast had not moved. Its patient furnace eyes remained on the throne, but in that patience lived a question shaped by something far older than vengeance. Would the Empire, at the final hour, release what it had swallowed, or would it spend the last of its power to keep the burial intact? The engine master collapsed beside his cradle, turned his ancient face upward with one last effort. In his ruined eyes lived the perfect comprehension of a man who had spent a lifetime in service to a machine and only now understood what the machine had been serving. "He has known," the old man whispered to no one in particular, "for longer than any of us have been alive." Neither Arcturus nor the Emperor denied it. From below, through the broken floor and the shattered conduit shaft, the green light rose again. The buried Titan continued its ascent, and in the sanctum between the guardian on his knee and the sovereign on his ancient seat, the silence that followed was entirely different from all the silences that had come before it. Those had been the silence of authority withheld. This one was the silence of authority laid down, whether in defeat or in something that might, from a sufficient distance and in a more honest age, be called wisdom. It was impossible to tell. The buried Titan rose through the mountain as water rises through fractured stone, not by force alone, but by the patient exploitation of every weakness that concealment had introduced over centuries of weight and compression. Where the ancient shaft walls held, it did not batter them. Where conduits and reliquary chambers lay in its path, it moved through their spaces with the unhurried intelligence of something that had memorized the architecture from below before the architects had finished drawing the plans above. Stone did not shatter before it. Stone yielded, in the way that truths yield passage through the minds of men who have exhausted their last denial. Arcturus' veil remained before the throne as the ascent trembled upward through the broken sanctum floor. He had not moved since the Emperor's words had altered the atmosphere of the chamber more profoundly than any weapon. Duty, that last coherent structure within him, had not abandoned its post, but it had lost its certainty of object. To guard the sovereign was the whole architecture of his being, yet the sovereign had spoken of nothing worth defending, and in those words had not resigned authority so much as redistributed it towards something Arcturus could not yet name. The sea-born Titan at the far breach had not advanced. It waited with the composure it had demonstrated since the first night of its arrival, fire banked behind ancient eyes, dorsal spines dimmed to a dull ember glow. Rubble lay in tremendous drifts around its legs. The sanctum's ruined grandeur framed it like a chapel built to the wrong god, and in the green-tinged light that still breathed from the broken column shaft, the beast's patience seemed less restraint than ceremony. It was observing a process. Its beam had severed the column deliberately, not to kill the Emperor, but to break the mechanism of concealment from its power source. What came next would come from below, where the origin lay. From the shaft the ascent drew nearer, and the sanctum prepared itself in the way of old buildings for final truth, by crumbling at the margins while holding in the center. Then Iorvan Hale rose through the broken floor. He climbed the last iron rungs of the shaft wall with the slowness of age and the precision of a man who has learned that blind bodies do not hurry where they cannot see. Seradve came just after him, one hand guiding the archivist's elbow, the other empty of any weapon it might once have drawn against a world whose categories had been dissolved. Both men were covered in the dust of the abyssal levels, their clothing pale with it, their faces drawn tight by the revelations through which they had passed. They entered the sanctum and stood still in its ruin, reading the room by its silence and its heat. Behind them, and above them, the buried Titan broke through. It rose not through the shaft but through the broader fractured floor around it, the black stone of the sanctum giving way in wide curved sections as its crowned head entered the chamber from below. The additional limbs emerged along the walls, finding purchase in the remains of structural conduits with the assured care of something that does not need to grip tightly, only to arrive. Green light poured from its facial aperture in revolving spires, and the dark sphere within turned with a gravity that pulled loose ash and debris into slow orbit. It was immense in the sanctum's ruin in a way the sea-born Titan had been immense in the open sky, not merely large but definitional. It did not fill the space, it revised it. When it was fully present, the two Titans regarded one another across the broken chamber. The meeting carried no hostility. In the green-white residue of the shattered halo rings, in the dimmed fire of the Emperor's seat, in the suspended stillness of guardian, archivist, and condemned priest, the two colossal presences held a communication wholly outside human register, yet its broad character was legible in the way of storms and geological processes, old accord confirming itself, purpose completing its arc, a circuit finally closed after ages of enforced interruption. The sea-born Titan lowered its head. The buried Titan extended one translucent blade-fingered hand toward the throne. It did not touch the Emperor. It opened its hand beside him, palm upward, in the gesture the herald beings had demonstrated below. Not command, not seizure. Offering. The emperor looked at the hand for a long time. Archoturus rose from his knee. He placed himself between the hand and the throne with the reflex of 3 centuries, armored body positioned as it had been positioned 1,000 times before dangerous presences. The buried titan's great eyes moved to him with the patience of continence. The emperor spoke again. "Stand aside, Archoturus." The custodian did not immediately obey. He had been made to not immediately obey anything that threatened the sovereign, and the obedience of the body ran deeper than the command of the moment. But then the emperor said something that undid the last lock. "I placed you here to guard against what I feared. I did not place you here to guard against what I chose." Arcturus stepped aside. From behind, Seradve's breathing changed. The old war priest moved forward and stood at the edge of the broken floor, looking down into the abyssal light below, where the herald beings had resumed their witness. The amphitheater, visible now through the widened shaft, blazed with the full awakening of every old script. The entombed listeners in their pillars burned with terminal luminosity. The vessel's shell had split completely, and from its halves ran the black fluid in channels that carved new paths through the ancient stone, finding the ocean bed's direction by instinct or design. "What does it reclaim?" Serad asked into the light. Iorvan answered beside him. "Everything that was taken by naming it sacred." He touched the shaft edge with one age-worn hand. "Every truth entombed in the service of continuity. Every history burned to keep a bargain invisible. Every mind simplified by worship into a quieter kind of obedience." He turned his brass-veiled face toward the emperor. Not from malice, from hunger managed across ages, the hunger of a lure waiting to be answered. The emperor did not respond to the accusation in this. He had heard it already in the green sermon. He had known its substance in silence longer than either man had breathed. What moved in his dimmed eyes now was neither guilt nor vindication, but the particular sorrow of a being who had chosen a necessary compromise in an hour of catastrophe and lived, through immeasurable suffering, to see the day when the terms of that compromise came finally to account. He reached out toward the buried titan's open hand. Bone-thin fingers, ringed with dead office, moved across the distance. Before they touched, the sea-born titan outside moved again. Not forward. It turned its vast body toward the ruined wall of the sanctum, toward the outer palace, toward the burning sky. As if its purpose here had shifted from confrontation to conclusion, it moved away from the throne with the deliberate calm of a tide going out. Its dorsal spines rose and fell in slow sequence. Where its feet struck the palace floor, deep resonances traveled outward through the mountain and into the waking abyssal network below, harmonics of completion rather than destruction. Arcturus followed its movement with his eyes. "It is leaving the sanctum. It has done what it came to do," Iorvan said. "Which was what?" The archivist turned toward the buried titan, toward the emperor, toward the hand still reaching across the space between sovereign and truth. "Break the seal. Release the witness. Allow what was answered to arrive." The emperor's fingers touched the offered hand. Light poured through the contact, not the white fire of imperial continuity, not the emerald radiance of abyssal machinery, but something that partook of both and transcended the purpose of each. It spread outward from that point of contact across the sanctum floor, across the mountain, through the abyssal architecture below, and upward through the shattered palace, where it met the cooling light of dawn entering through the ruined rooflines. Across the throne world, every buried node of the ancient apparatus activated in sequence, not as weapons, not as engines of dominion, as recorders. What they released into the world were not commands but depositions, the full history of the lure, the bargain, the concealment, and the civilizations built atop them, transmitted through every consecrated surface, every buried conduit, every shrine lamp and cathedral resonator simultaneously. The truth that the empire had spent itself to suppress took less than a heartbeat to distribute. Seradve sat down on a broken stone and covered his face with both hands. He did not weep. He was past weeping. He breathed in the slow, measured rhythm of a man who has survived a war and not yet decided what he is in its absence. Iorvan knelt. Arcturus stood at the broken edge of the sanctum floor and looked down into the amphitheater where the old world had just surrendered its last secret to its first honest light. And from the depths below, though the sermon had ended and the circuit had closed, a final resonance moved upward through the mountain, with the gentleness of something returning what it had never meant to keep. Dawn came to the throne world in stages that bore no resemblance to the dawns men had worshipped there for 9,000 years. The liturgical calendars kept in the great observatories had always described sunrise over the sanctified capital as an event of theological precision, the first ray touching the sovereign's eastern spire at the exact moment prescribed by the Ashen calendar, confirming by celestial mechanics that the universe endorsed the empire's continuation. Generations of priest astronomers had adjusted those calculations, trimmed them with careful revisions, bent observation gently toward the conclusion that the sky itself was an expression of imperial order. On this morning there were no observatories to make the adjustment. There were no spires to receive the ordained light. The eastern face of the palace mountain had collapsed in the night into its own foundations, and the first pale wash of dawn moved not over gold and consecrated marble, but over fields of cooling slag and the vast disturbed plain of the outer city's ruin. Still the light came. It entered through broken walls and roofless archways. It traveled along corridors whose floors bore the fused impressions of things that had passed through them with terrible speed. It found pools of dark fluid from the abyssal vessel, now still and cooling, their surfaces acquiring the stillness of ordinary water. It climbed the rubble of shattered saints and played across their fragments without distinction. A holy hand here, a conqueror's face there, a martyr's gilded foot resting beside a chunk of plain wall, as if deposition had made them equal at last. In the sanctum what remained of the throne still burned, not with the sustained machinery of imperial continuity. The pain engines had fallen silent in the hour before dawn, their mechanisms finally exceeded by what the night had demanded of them. The halo rings hung still above the throne's apex, bent from their mountings, trailing golden chains like dead vines. Yet from within the throne itself, from the junction where the emperor's hands now rested upon the buried titan's open palm, a residual light persisted. It was quieter than anything the sanctum had contained before, neither white nor emerald, but somewhere in the narrow region between those colors, a shade that suggested resolution without naming it. The emperor's body had not survived the contact intact. What remained upon the seat was diminished further, as if the immense outpouring of the buried circuit's full activation had consumed the last reserves of the physical architecture that had housed his consciousness through its centuries of terrible endurance. The withered form was smaller now, collapsed against the mechanisms of the seat in a posture that had finally surrendered its long performance of majesty. Yet the eyes remained open, dimmer than they had burned in the hours of the duel and the consecration, but present, watching the light that his empire would not live to consecrate. Arcturus Vale sat on a block of fallen ceiling stone before the throne. He had not been able to stand for the last hour, not from injury, though the night had left its marks in cracked armor, burned flesh, and the deep bruising of concussive proximity. He sat because standing implied a readiness for further action, and he had not yet determined what action remained available to him in a world whose entire structure of purpose had been remade while he watched. His guardian spear was gone. His orders had been rendered obsolete by the issuing authority itself. 3 centuries of orientation had been built around one absolute center, and that center had, in an act that could be called either betrayal or liberation depending on the courage of the interpreter, stepped willingly from the machinery of its own deification. He looked at the emperor and felt something he had no training to process. It was not grief, though grief lived inside it. It was not awe, though awe had been there since the moment the eyes opened. What it most closely resembled was the sensation a navigator experiences when the stars he has used since youth are confirmed to have shifted, not gone, not false, but repositioned in the long, slow motion of ages, and the charts he trusted no longer describing the sky above with exact fidelity. Iorvan Hale sat in the far corner of the sanctum, his back against a length of intact wall. He had not spoken since the circuit's release. The metal leaves from the archive below lay across his knees, most of them blank now, the ancient script having burned away in the moment of transmission, as if the record had fulfilled its purpose and required no further preservation. His hands moved across the blank surfaces with the habitual care of a man who had spent his life in the service of what others forgot or destroyed. Now that the forgetting had ended, he did not know what his hands were meant to do next. Serad Vey stood at the breach in the sanctum wall where the sea-born titan had withdrawn, looking out over the ruined palace and the city below. The titan itself had not left the throne world. It moved in the far distance, its dorsal spines visible above the skyline of the outer districts, pulsing with the slow rhythm of a creature in no particular haste. Around its passage, fires guttered and in some places ceased. The rain that had begun before dawn, pushed inward by the atmospheric disturbances of the long night, fell across the burning districts with the impassive generosity of weather that has no theology. Where the beast's feet struck the outer plains, the ground trembled, but the trembling carried no secondary destruction. It was passing through, not continuing what it had begun. The city burned where it had burned and did not burn where it had not. The great machine of ruin had arrived at its own completion. Serad did not find this comforting. He found it honest, which was worse. He turned back to the sanctum, to the emperor, to the custodian sitting on his fragment of fallen ceiling, to the blind archivist with his empty pages. "What do we tell them?" he asked. The question was genuine. Below the mountain, in the surviving hive corridors and refugee warrens, in the orbital stations still cycling above a changed world, in the pilgrim roads where survivors of the night's first hours huddled beneath broken viaducts, millions waited in the particular terror of those who have lost the narrative that organized their endurance. The empire had not merely been a political structure, it had been the story in which they lived. That story had not ended cleanly. It had been interrupted at its deepest premise, and the interruption had released something vast and old and true. But truth did not automatically provide the survivors with bread, shelter, or the capacity to rise from grief and continue. Eorvan turned his brass-veiled face toward the war priest. "Tell them what happened. They will not accept it. Some will not. Some will build new sanctities from the ruins before the ash is cold, and name whatever they find first divine." He paused. "But some will sit with what they heard from the old apparatus in the moment of release. Some will be different for it, even if they cannot say how." Architruus said nothing. He looked at the emperor, who had not spoken since the contact with the buried titan. The sovereign's eyes moved between the three men with a quality Archotrus had spent his life being too obedient to recognize. He recognized it now. The emperor was not surveying subjects. He was regarding survivors, of whom he was one, and listening to their argument with the attention of a man who had no further authority to resolve it, and no desire to pretend otherwise. Outside, the dawn brightened. The buried titan had not returned to the abyss. In the hours of the night, as the circuit released and the apparatus transmitted its long-suppressed record into every consecrated surface of the world, the creature had completed its portion of the old design and entered a stillness deeper than sleep. It remained below the sanctum in the abyssal amphitheater, its partial emergence from the vessel now irreversible, its presence in the mountain no longer concealed by the mechanisms of the lure. What it would do in the days that followed was not known. The herald beings had withdrawn through passages too deep and narrow for human investigation. The entombed listeners in the pillars had darkened, their terminal luminosity spent. The mountain held the buried thing, and the buried thing held its stillness. Through the broken roof of the sanctum, the first true ray of morning entered. It crossed the slag and rubble floor and climbed the steps of the throne and rested at last upon the emperor's open eyes, and in that light his face was simply a face, ancient, damaged, and awake after too long without honest rest. Whether what it expressed was peace remained uncertain. Whether peace was what the throne world deserved was more uncertain still. The rain fell. The sea-born titan walked in the outer districts, unhurried and immense. The survivors beneath broken viaducts began to move again, because survival has its own imperative that waits for no emperor, no theology, and no resolution of cosmic argument. And the long silence that followed the sovereignty of the throne world was filled, as all such silences eventually are, not with answers but with the sound of people who have survived something unsurvivable, deciding one by one and without ceremony what they intended to become. 3 days after the night of the Jade Comet, the rain had not stopped. It fell without the ceremony of storm, without thunder or liturgical symmetry, simply a grey persistent descent that filled the craters of the outer city with shallow mirrors and laid a fine ash paste across every surface the fires had not already consumed. In the throne sector, where the palace mountain rose in its new configuration of ruin and exposed antiquity, the rain gathered in the hollows of collapsed saints and ran in thin rills down the faces of shattered walls. No one had given orders for its management. There were no drainage ceremonies, no appointed engineers of sacred water, no priests to determine its omen weight. The rain fell because rain falls, and the throne world received it without interpretation for the first time in its long history. Arcturus Vale remained in the sanctum. He had slept there, twice, on the stone beside his fallen comrades. He had eaten from a cache of emergency rations discovered in a sub-chamber still sealed beneath the rubble, sharing them with Iorvan Hale and Serad Vey without ceremony or hierarchy. He had dressed his own wounds, examined the injuries of the surviving custodians, and helped carry the dead to a place of dignified arrangement along the sanctum's western wall, where the least damaged mosaics still depicted scenes from an age when the Empire had been something other than a device for sustained concealment. He had not prayed. He had not been able to locate the appropriate object for prayer in a landscape whose sacred geography had been redrawn. Each morning he came before the throne and looked at the Emperor. The sovereign endured, not strongly. The machinery of the pain engines had ceased, and without their sustained intervention, the body held itself upright by some principle no physician the Empire had ever produced could have named, and no scripture had anticipated. The eyes remained open. The faint light between white and emerald persisted at the junction of ancient hands and the buried Titan's extended palm, which had not withdrawn. The contact between them had not ended with the circuit's release. Something continued there, quiet, mutual, and entirely unlike the transactional machinery that had governed the throne's relationship with devotion for 9,000 years. On the third morning, others came. They arrived in small groups through the collapsed outer passages, having navigated the rubble of the palace's interior by instinct and necessity rather than by any summons. A surviving signal master, her equipment destroyed but her training intact. 2 junior hierarchs from minor orders, whose primary temples had stood at sufficient distance from the blast corridors to survive as roofless shells. A company of common soldiers, not the ceremonial palace guard, but line infantry from the outer fortifications who had held their post through the long night and now sought, in the manner of surviving soldiers everywhere, the location of whatever authority remained. A group of civilian scribes from the lower city's administrative quarter, their hands still ink-stained, carrying between them a bundle of blank record sheets in a gesture simultaneously habitual and heartbreaking. Serad Vey met them at the sanctum's broken threshold and told them what had happened. He used no approved register. He employed none of the rhetorical forms in which the Empire had trained its communicants to process cataclysm as sanctified narrative. He described the night factually, with the spare precision of a man who had been present for too much of it to ornament any part. He told them about the abyssal chamber beneath the throne, about the lure and the bargain, about the ancient apparatus and the civilizations entombed in its design, about the heralds of the deep and what they had spoken in the sub-vaults, about the buried Titan, the circuit, and the transmission that had moved through every consecrated surface of the world in the moment of release. He told them that the Emperor had chosen to allow it. The responses were what Iorvan Hale had predicted, various, immediate, and distributed across the full range of what human minds do when the organizing story is removed and truth is laid in its place without preparation. Some wept, some argued that Serad was deceived or corrupted. One of the hierarchs sat very still and then quietly removed the devotional seals from his collar and placed them on the floor, not in anger, not in apostasy, but with the manner of a craftsman setting down tools that no longer fit the work. The signal master began compiling records immediately, already transforming crisis into documentation, because the impulse to preserve outlasted the structures that had originally determined what deserved preserving. Iorvan sat to one side of this, listening to the shape of the responses rather than their content. His blank metal leaves lay in his lap. At some point during the proceedings he began to write again, pressing new script into the blank surfaces with a stylus salvaged from the debris. What he wrote was not history in the approved form. It was closer to testimony, the account of a witness who understood that the value of the record lay not in its authority, but in its honesty. Arcturus observed everything from his position near the throne and understood that the hour of transition required no guardian. Transitions do not need to be defended, only endured. Yet he did not move from his post, because the Emperor was still present, and the Emperor was still something, even if the nature of that something had changed so profoundly that no existing vocabulary adequately contained it. On the afternoon of the third day the Emperor spoke again. It was not a decree. It carried none of the formal weight of sovereign command, none of the immense theological freight of a voice that had once been said to hold worlds together by the fact of its continuity. It was an address to the people gathered in the ruins of his throne room, delivered in the same stripped and tired voice that had told Arcturus there was nothing worth defending beneath the throne. He said, "I governed what I was given. What I was given was built on a foundation I inherited without full understanding and maintained without full honesty. Both of those statements are true, neither exonerates the other. No one in the sanctum spoke. The truth has now been returned to the world that produced it. A pause in which the residual light between his hands and the buried Titan's palm shifted briefly in its quiet cycling. What the world chooses to build upon that truth is no longer mine to determine. He closed his eyes, not in the sealed unconsciousness of the centuries before, not in the death that many had expected. He closed them as a man closes his eyes when he has finished speaking and intends no further interruption to the silence that follows. The light at the junction of contact did not cease. It diminished to its quietest expression, a steady dim pulse between green and white, like a lighthouse seen from a very far shore. Arcturus looked at the closed eyes for a long time. He had knelt before them for 300 years in obedience. He had stood before them in crisis. He had sat with them across 3 days of ruin. Now they were closed, and the man behind them was neither dead nor absent, but simply no longer performing the office of sovereign over a civilization whose foundation had been dissolved in the long night by honest light and abyssal reckoning. The custodian turned and faced the gathered survivors in the broken sanctum. He was still armored. The armor was cracked and stained and bore the marks of the worst night in the Empire's history. He still stood in the posture of his centuries of service. He did not know how not to stand that way. He said nothing for a moment, because nothing he had been given to say applied, and he was not yet certain of what he himself would choose to offer in the absence of instruction. Behind him the Emperor rested in the quiet pulse of the buried Titan's extended hand, in the rain falling through the broken roof, in the ash-gray morning of a world that had survived its revelation and not yet decided what to do with the surviving. And before him, the people of the fallen empire looked back with eyes that held in various measures of grief and clarity and the stubborn undying impulse toward continuation, the same unresolved question that every ending eventually puts to those who outlast it. What now? Arcturus Vale, custodian of the inner radiance, guardian of an empty doctrine and a living man, drew a slow breath in the rain-cold air of the broken sanctum and began, without precedent or permission to speak,